Hey everybody, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, today's video came across my feed and it's from a channel favorite, History Matters, and it looks to answer a question that I've actually thought about but never really pursued further. It's called, why didn't Castro try to retake Guantanamo Bay from America? Because you've probably heard that, the Guantanamo Bay detention center has been a place the United States has used for decades to apprehend criminals of the state, but it's in Cuba, which has been an adversary of the United States ever since the Cuban Revolution and all those, skirmishes between the US and Cuba. So kind of selfishly, I picked this video because I want to learn about it and love to have you along with me. All right, this original video is linked down below. Make sure you are supporting them. Make sure you've also subbed to Mr. Terry Originals, my new original content channel. It's got a lot of fun stuff. It's linked down below as well. All right, let's get started. Cuba.
The entire island of Cuba famously does not belong to the Cuban government.
Right.
You see, this small part here, the southern part of Guantanamo Bay, has been home to an American naval base since 1903. And as you'll likely know, there have been points during that time where the Cuban and US governments really didn't get along.
Context going back to kind of the original US control of the region goes from the Spanish-American War, when it was a Spanish colony, and colonies from the Spanish, including Cuba, were seceded in this.
And as you'll likely know, there have been points during that time where the Cuban and US governments really didn't get along.
Cuban Missile Crisis,
the premiership of Fidel Castro, when these relations were at their lowest point, he wasn't able to retake Guantanamo Bay for himself and his country. Which raises the obvious question, why not? Why didn't Castro and Communist Cuba try to take Guantanamo Bay and make the island whole once more?
Right.
So to learn how Cuba...
Because, just kind of going into this, I was, thinking to myself, if it was to kind of have an attempt, like a military takeover attempt, how much do you think the U.S. would invest in the defense of it, if anything at all, or would they let it just kind of go? I guess it would also depend on what time it was at, but let's continue.
Communist Cuba tried to take Guantanamo Bay and make the island whole once more. So to learn how Cuba ended up in this position, we've got to go back to the 19th century. Not you, not this time. In the closing years of which the Cubans revolted against Spanish rule. Like most revolutionaries before them, the Cubans imagined that they would get to keep all of their territory upon independence, but fun fact, no. Their war against the Spanish soon caught the attention of the US of A, and after a main sinking, calls to remove Spain's last imperial territories from the Western Hemisphere grew rapidly.
Blame the Main on Spain, an event that did not go down like it was, as there was an explosion on the ship that, was blamed on like Spanish aggression, but nevertheless, war continues and begins. The US wins, Spain secedes a lot, including the Philippines, by the way.
Now, many Americans wanted Spain out of Cuba, but that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted Cuba to be free. And so, to preempt this, the less expansionist members of Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which, as part of the act giving President McKinley the right to intervene in Cuba, made it clear that the United States was not allowed to keep it.
Let's also remember the larger context of Monroe Doctrine, where the United States tried to make it clear to Europe to stay out of Western Hemispheric affairs. Right, that era sort of this like direct imperialism is supposed to be ending, supposed to be over, and the US will stay out of the affairs over there.
Now, the government being forbidden from annexing Cuba is not the same as being forbidden from annexing any of it. And during the Spanish-American War, the US found that Guantanamo Bay was well suited as a naval base, mostly because it gave much quicker access to the rest of the Caribbean, which was useful for keeping an eye on any European ambitions there. And so, after the Spanish were defeated, Cuba was occupied by the United States, which agreed to leave once the new independent government was up and running. Now, this independence came at a price, because the Americans had just passed the Platt Amendment, meant to override the Teller Amendment. And Washington not only wanted the naval base as well as this island, but also the perpetual right to intervene in Cuba.
The United States is also going to kind of try to perpetuate that leadership there is also going to be pro-American. May have heard of Batista, who was a president and dictator there, who played a very prominent role there, but was also supported by American interests, economic interests, and was the key figure that was targeted by the communist revolution of the Cubans in the 1950s. So yes, Cuba was going to get its independence, but the Americans were making sure that they were going to have a continued vested interest in here.
Should it do anything that threatened American interests there or in the region? This was begrudgingly agreed by the Cubans in 1901 because what real choice did they have, and 2 years later the US built themselves a naval base in the bay, which they would lease for a small annual sum. This led the Americans to by and large ignore their claim on this island, and eventually it was just sort of agreed that it was now Cuba's. Over the next decades,
But again, American economic interest being a major feature of this, 50 years or so of early Cuban independence, which grew increasingly unpopular by locals.
The US routinely intervened against any destabilizing forces in Cuba, and steadily began to economically dominate the island. This continued until the early years of the Cold War during the fractured rule of President Fulgencio Batista. Batista had a great relationship with the United States, in that he was happy to sell Cuba to it in return for Washington propping him up. And maintaining the base at Guantanamo Bay meant that the US and its help were never too far away for him.
Right.
Over time, he became much more tyrannical, and so resistance to him, notably by students with communist sympathies, increased massively. And soon resistance turned into open rebellion. To combat this,
like a young
Batista
Fidel
strengthened the
Castro.
military, which promptly tried to overthrow him, but failed. He then opted for the tried and true response of purging the army, which did keep it loyal to him, but it did mean that the inexperienced people now running it weren't as capable of dealing with the rebels. Said rebels were by and large a mishmash of different groups with varying objectives, barring the ousting of Batista, that is.
Because there was a lot of, like for example, you didn't need to necessarily be of a communist ideology to be against the Batista dictatorship there. It could unify a lot of different people, like you can see here. We want a communist utopia, a Catholic society, an actual democracy. One thing all those groups could agree on was they didn't want an American propped up dictatorship that they felt was exploiting their country.
However, the largest and most effective group was the July 26th movement, led by a certain Fidel Castro. By 1958, said rebels were in control of these parts of Cuba, and after Batista rigged the end of the year election, the US stopped providing him with weapons, which of course made things much easier for the rebels.
Yeah.
And within a couple of months, Batista had fled, the revolutionaries were in charge of the major cities, and the Cuban Revolution was over. Mostly. Kind of. Well, not really. You see, the coalition of rebels were now in charge. Whilst they could put their differences aside fighting against a common enemy, when it became clear though that not everyone could get what they wanted, tensions rose. Castro was in charge of the most guys with guns, and so he got to choose the new interim president, before telling said president to make him prime minister. He announced that there would be elections, but don't worry, he banned all opposing political parties too, so that he, on behalf...
Classic, right? I know better. By the way, I had a long discussion with our friend Nick, the Fat Electrician. Check out our live stream. He came on to my channel, and we were talking just basically about communism. We talked about the Soviet Union. We were talking about Cuba. We were taking, questions from the chat. And that was, really interesting to kind of have that conversation. And if I remember here after the video, I'll link that down below. But we talked, a lot about kind of the Cuban history there. And
of the people could take all of that troublesome and tiring thinking out of the process. He would soon change his mind and ban elections altogether, but long story short, Cuba was now Castro's, barring the short-lived rebellion by his former associates. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that Castro and his fellow co-revolutionaries didn't believe that America's ownership of part of Guantanamo Bay was legitimate,
right.
And they argued that it was an agreement between the USA and a dead government.
They also took over industries that were owned by the United States. One of the big grievances of the American government was there was no compensation basically for those capital owners that had their investments basically seized. Sort of thing Nick brings up when we were discussing this.
And thus was void, meaning that it would be nice if the US Navy just simply left. Now, running a country after overthrowing its government means that some things are naturally going to get overlooked. And one thing that the new communist government did was to cash the American check for the Guantanamo lease. Now, Castro claimed that this was an oversight, but the Americans quickly claimed that by accepting the money, the new rulers of Cuba had legitimized the lease, and so...
Hey, you took the money, you can't have it both ways, kind of what they're saying there. Okay, this is the stuff that I'm learning now, because I'll be honest, with a lot of my understanding, know about the relationship between the United States and Cuba, especially through the revolution here, and then Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff like that. But then especially sort of after that is where it get a little bit murky. Now, what we did have was Fidel Castro ruling for, decades there. But yeah, getting to where I am really looking to learn. And now I really am at this point.
Communist government did was to cash the American check for the Guantanamo lease. Now, Castro claimed that this was an oversight, but the Americans quickly claimed that by accepting the money, the new rulers of Cuba had legitimized the lease, and so therefore, no backsies. Obviously, that's not really how things work, because it's not like Eisenhower or any of his successors would have handed Guantanamo Bay over anyway. And in the decades following this, the Havana government...
Maybe I wasn't paying attention enough. Did you say what year that was? When, this, checking of this, cashing of this check with this, new Cuban government exactly took place here? Because I want to know where it fell in line with Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis.
Government was sure to never cash another one of those checks, and it maintained that the United States had absolutely no rights to the base, or anything else on Cuba, which is why the government nationalized basically everything, and the former American owners got nothing in return. Yeah. So Castro obviously wanted the Guantanamo... That
was one of the big kind of disagreements that was used as justification for the, bad relations with the country between the U.S. government and Cuba, was what happened with those American investments there.
Basically everything, and their former American owners got nothing in return. So Castro obviously wanted the Guantanamo territory back under Cuban control, but he wasn't a dummy. Whilst the US garrison there was small enough that he would have been able to capture it fairly quickly, it's not like the US would have just simply accepted that its soldiers had been killed and its territory attacked.
True.
In fact, not only did Castro and his government refuse to consider attacking the US base there directly, but during the first years of their rule, they were terrified of the Americans invading Cuba to remove them, which was a fair concern because that's what they wanted to do.
And tried multiple times. There were multiple attempts of coups to try to get the Castro government out. Yeah, it was a very legitimate concern.
Were terrified of the Americans invading Cuba to remove them, which was a fair concern because that's what they wanted to do. Now I know what you're thinking. This is because of the US's right to intervene in Cuba, part of its constitution, if America's interests were ever threatened. But actually it wasn't, because Franklin D. Roosevelt had given up that right in the 1930s to improve relations with Cuba. He still kept the base though, that was just useful. Their fear actually came from the fact that the United States was a hegemonic superpower, and could do whatever it wanted in the region with very little pushback. In response to Castro's takeover, President Eisenhower embargoed the country and began preparing for an invasion of Cuba.
And that's, one of those things that was bipartisan for, decades and decades in the United States, whether you had a Republican in office and a Republican controlled, Congress, and same thing with Democrats, was just keeping up that basically no diplomacy with Cuba, just decades and decades, only till very recently. And really, I guess after Fidel Castro is gone, that it starts to move in another direction.
Not by the US military, though, and could do whatever it wanted in the region with very little pushback. In response to Castro's takeover, President Eisenhower embargoed the country and began preparing for an invasion of Cuba. Not by the US military, though. Castro was seen as far too popular with the Cuban people, and the worry in America was that casualties would be far too high.
I mean, again, a lot of opposition had been purged by that. There was also an exodus of people out of Cuba, people that, were, I guess, threatened as being, potential collaborators, especially of a previous regime. So you're going to have that. But then, again, you still have a large amount of the population that, supported the new government.
Instead, this invasion would be undertaken by exiled Cubans who opposed the new government. Eisenhower left office before this plan could be enacted, but John F. Kennedy, his successor, went ahead with the operation. Yeah,
so Kennedy had heard about this. It was secret then. I mean, he was a senator of Massachusetts and did not know anything about this plan. Remember, these are CIA operations after World War II, with the United States wanting to not go to direct war in this new, nuclear world. It was all about covert missions and CIA training people behind the scenes. And what that led to is a lot of people in the government not knowing about a lot of these missions that were being, trained for. So it was approved upon by Eisenhower. And then Kennedy comes in and then learns about it and gave it the go ahead. Again, shows you a lot about the bipartisanship, with Kennedy being Democrat and the Eisenhower, with Eisenhower being a Republican, that they're both like, yeah, we don't like Cuba and what's going on over there, especially as a new communist neighbor.
This invasion would take place here at the Bay of Pigs, and it did not go well. Castro quickly won, and as a result, his relationship with
really
the USSR
embarrassing for the US,
because they believed that if Cuba were to be uncommunistified, then it would make them look weak internationally. As a result, the two intensified their military alliance, and the Soviet Union stationed nuclear weapons there, and thus Cuban Missile Crisis. During this, the US base on Guantanamo took a new importance for both sides.
I've covered this stuff a lot, so if you're looking for more detailed commentary about the Bay of Pigs invasion or Cuban Missile Crisis, plenty of videos if you want to hear me talk about that more.
The Americans evacuated civilians from the base and massively reinforced the garrison there to deter any offensives from Cuba. This wasn't going to be a problem though, because the Soviets there had just opted to point a nuclear missile at it, meaning that it would have been vaporized 15 seconds after everything went wrong. Now, Castro saw this crisis as an opportunity for him to regain Guantanamo. When the three nations began to negotiate over how they could all not die, Castro listed his demands, which he hoped that the US would agree to in return for the nukes going back home. These demands were that 1, the US would end the economic embargo, 2, it would stop trying to off Castro and overthrow his government, 3, the USA would respect Cuba's sovereign waters, 4, the same but for Cuba's airspace, and 5, it would of course return Guantanamo Bay. JFK didn't want to do any of this, and so he did something clever. He claimed to the USSR that this disagreement was solely between superpowers, and that Castro shouldn't be allowed to torpedo negotiations that were so important.
This is actually really going to upset Castro, that they were basically talking about the future of Cuba without really involving Castro. And so you just had Khrushchev and Kennedy talking over each other, and the Cubans kind of felt betrayed by Khrushchev and the Soviet Union for what's going to happen there. Because, you know, these agreements actually do come to fruition, and it kind of left Cuba on its own that way.
And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, agreed because Castro was kind of hard to work with. And by ignoring Cuba's demands, he had a better chance of getting what he wanted.
Yeah. Well, what the Soviet Union also wanted way more was the U.S. to remove their missiles from Turkey. And that agreement actually will happen. And interestingly, as part of the deal where Kennedy, I guess, got kind of one up on it, was he basically got Khrushchev to not announce that the U.S. had pulled its missiles out of Turkey, which would have been a huge PR boost and just like a thing that could have really helped Khrushchev's image, you know, that he had got something out of this with the Soviets, you know, taking their missiles out. Because that was the whole justification. The Soviets were like, well, if y'all have, you know, nukes in Turkey, which is right by us, and I guess we should have it with our ally in Cuba, who's right by you. But yeah, Khrushchev, he didn't spill the beans either. And if you know about him, there's basically a coup to get him out of government, and him, you know, maybe publicly being able to discuss the concessions the Americans made probably would have helped his image a lot. So helpful, I guess, in the big picture of kind of Cold War tensions, but it hurt his political career, which won't last much longer.
This obviously wasn't what Castro had hoped for, but after the crisis was over, the Soviet Union promised to keep some troops in Cuba, because at least that way, if the US invaded again, then the Soviets would be forced to get involved. But outside of that, the Cubans didn't really get much from the crisis. And the US, not even for a second, ever considered handing over its naval base. And after this, the Cubans weren't really able to do much about the Americans on their island.
And the US, I mean, the Soviet Union wasn't like, you know, part of the deal, even talking about Guantanamo. They didn't give a crap. So I'm sure Castro would have loved, the Soviet Union would have, you know, put that in negotiations to just have all American presence on the island gone.
They wanted it gone, and the Americans didn't want to leave. And given the massive disparity in power between the two, the only way they were going to get the Americans out was via a diplomatic agreement. But there was nothing Castro could give them that would make such a trade worth it. And thus, Cuba had to resort to diplomatic nagging.
That makes sense now, because I'm thinking about it. Diplomacy, there's no way a diplomatic measure could work with that. Yeah, what would the United States, you know, give in return? What do they have that Cuba wants? Maybe compensation for those industries that were nationalized, the American-owned industries. I mean, that, I guess, could have been something. That could have been something that may have been more successful to talk about right with kind of the new independence that they had there. But no, that would have been very difficult to do. How would you fund such a thing? You know, you just had a revolution.
And it was shocking to learn that this didn't work, and the United States remains there until this day. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons.
Very good.
James Bizanet, Sky.
Final thoughts. Fantastic little video here. By the way, I noticed this video is 8 minutes long. They're kind of the kings of like those 3-minute videos. So they went into a lot of depth, and I did not expect them to go into as much of the history of Cuba that they did. I mean, they, again, went back to the 1800s and starting with the colonial era, then, you know, snuck in the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis and that kind of stuff. So they really packed this in with a lot of really good information. I think I need to be watching History Matters more than I'm covering on my channel. So feel free to keep bringing in those requests and certain videos you guys want me to check out for them. All right, guys, thanks again for hanging out. Sub to the new channel, Mr. Terry Originals, link down below. We'll see you next time.